Y'all ready to get? Let's get to work. Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to everybody. It is a beautiful day in the Commonwealth. Some of my friends told me it's supposed to be 80 degrees on Thursday, and then we might see some snow after that on Friday or Saturday or something. So crazy times, but at least when it snows at that time of year, it's probably a little bit easier for us to deal with than February 1st. So welcome to the opening of the workshop agenda here for the Commonwealth Transportation Board. I will tell you as I get started, I know that the folks around this table know this, but I will reiterate it. There's a tremendous amount of work that goes in by the staff to get us to where we are when we hit this meeting place and afterwards. And, you know, there's lots of work. I sit down with them and tell them everything that I can find that's possibly wrong with what they're producing, so that when it gets to you, it's as good as I think we can get it to be, given the resources, and I think it's pretty darn good, to tell you the truth. So we've, as you have noticed, we have tried to work very hard as your staff to make sure your presentations are cogent, they're on point, they give you what the information you need, and hopefully not more than you need, or not so much that you drown in it. So that's really our goal as we work with this, and I would tell you that I've been really pleased with what we've been able to produce that comes out of DRPT and VDOT and others, OEP and the rest of the group to produce this for you. So just realize we're all working really hard, we're really busy, but we got a lot of good stuff going on. We're excited to do. Appreciate it. Having said that, the first item on the workshop agenda.
Pledge of Allegiance.
Excuse me?
Pledge.
Yeah, is the Pledge of Allegiance. Thank you very much. So if you will join me in standing. Pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right. Woman here.
Thank you all very much. The first item on our agenda after the pledge this morning is a Smart Skill Program review. John, are you going to speak for just a moment? Deputy Secretary Lawson is going to have a short presentation, and then we're going to hear from Ms. Jackson and Mr. Chang.
Yeah, good morning, Mr. Secretary and members of the board. Just wanted to make a few very brief opening comments before they take over and run through the presentation. I just wanted to acknowledge, you know, we are really looking forward to this opportunity to do a very deep dive and extensive review of Smart Scale. And I want to make it ultimately clear, though, nothing that we're doing says Smart. I think all of you know, Smart Scale has done a great job. You know, this board has stood it up. We're in the remaining throes of round 5. At the completion of round 5, we will have allocated about $6 billion through Smart Scale, supporting about $14 billion worth of projects. And we've gone through some tweaks after every round. We look at how it worked, what may have not done exactly what we thought, and this is really a holistic review. VDOT and DRPT are thoroughly or heavily engaged in the process that OEP is going to be talking about today. And we are really looking at, you know, the scoring and the administration of the process to make sure it is doing what it is ultimately intended to do, is to help provide the best information to the board to determine what are the most valuable projects that we can fund with the resources that we have. So I just wanted to say that before we got started, and I'll turn it over to them. Thank you.
Ms. Jackson. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you. Members of the board, Mr. Secretary, thank you for having us today. We are here to discuss the overview of the Smart Scale Process Review that John introduced. I have here with me Ho Chang, who is the CEO of ATCS, and they will be leading the external independent component of the process review. Review that we've been tasked with. The Smart Scale process has been in place since, I'm going to go ahead and get this going. can go to the next slide because the clicker's not working. Okay, thank you. So the smart scale process has been in place since 2016. I was here last month presenting on the round 5 staff recommended funding scenario. So we have 5 rounds under our belt. Thank you. And Secretary Miller has directed OIP to conduct a full review of the smart scale process after 5 rounds. We're doing this in collaboration with VDOT and DRPT and our external partners as we go throughout this entire review. And as John mentioned, the objective of this review is to ensure that we're meeting the intended goal to identify the projects that provide the greatest benefit for the investment that is put forward by the board.
Will not work.
Yeah. Thank you. Next slide. So we see 4 key components of this smart scale process review. Different folks will be leading these components, but this is an overview of the 4 pieces that we see happening of this entire process comprehensive review. The first is statistical analysis on historical data of the past 5 rounds of smart scale. And this is going to be on the staff recommended funding scenarios that we present in January. So that data is the data that will be analyzed. They will be looking for potential biases and causes that come about in the review, also an analysis of the outcomes of the. Next, we will have 2 surveys for stakeholders, one to guide the external review that Ho is going to be leading, and one to guide the internal review, which we're calling the procedural review, which I'll go over next. The procedural review is OIP's post-round review that we do, and I will show and go over that on a following slide here. But this gets into the nuts and bolts of the administration of smart scale. This is going over application updates, communication, process improvements, scoring improvements. The weeds of smart scale is what we're calling the procedural review, screening and validation. This will lead to a review of the smart scale code and policy, and resulting in possible recommendations that might come at the end of this study. And we're anticipating that that will wrap up in the fall of 2023. So we'll be back in October with final recommendations and adoption possibly in December. All right, so I'm going to
Can
hand
I
it over.
interrupt for a second? I think it's really important to, for us to get as much input as we can from the users of this. And so we sent that, the survey information out. We've sent it to the General Assembly members. Certainly any of us, anybody in the audience, anybody that wants to weigh in. It's sort of the more, the better from my perspective, because sometimes we just don't think of everything, right? And so we have a long list of things that we're sort of thinking about and considering. I'm sure that each of y'all have some concerns or some thoughts. So I would encourage you with your folks that you work with in your communities to make sure they get their thoughts into us, because we can't get better unless we know how.
Mr. Secretary, I just, for clarification purposes, do you want the CTB members to fill it out?
You know, that's fine, because we obviously, at the end of the day, we're going to decide as a group.
Right.
Right? I don't want to sort of get mixed in with everybody else.
Well, that's my concern as well, so that's the reason I didn't fill it out.
Right, so
Yeah.
I think we're best served by our responses into ourselves.
Okay.
And let everybody that's not as involved in us, maybe we look at them separately, but I certainly, I mean, at the end of the day, this board, you all will decide.
Thanks
right?
for
So,
clarifying.
Yes, ma'am, thank you. All right, any questions? Thank you very much.
One.
Yes, sir.
Will that survey be shared with this group at some
Yeah,
point?
absolutely.
Okay.
Surveys yeah, absolutely. We will look at that and all sorts of staff input and all sorts of things. And they'll
And
make
also-
recommendations, yes. Sir.
me, sir.
Go ahead, sir.
And I'll provide more information about how the survey will be part of what we'll be doing.
I
So,
just want you all to promote it, that's all. Thank you.
We have been.
morning.
Yes, sir.
So as we analyze the performance and outcomes of the past funding rounds, this slide gives us some idea, it's not all, but some idea of what we'll be looking at for the statistical analysis portion of our review. So weighting of the 6 factor areas and reviewing the 4 typologies, project type, project size, geography of these projects. And let's look at some potential biases in the program and the outcomes, possibly. Urban versus rural, we've heard that before. Project size. Smaller projects get favored over larger projects or vice versa. We've heard that as well. And what may be causing these potential biases? We'll look for how it's related to how we evaluate. And also look at evaluation, an opportunity for enhanced use of performance data and usage modeling in determining project benefits, looking at our current condition. A lot of different things we'll be looking at as part of this review. And speaking of the survey, let me give you a little more detail in terms of the survey that we're talking about. We're talking about 2 surveys that will help inform our work. First is a process review survey, which is open currently. The survey went out to over 1,900 stakeholders, including General Assembly members, regional entities like our MPOs and PDCs, and localities, staff and elected officials, and public transit agencies. Very comprehensive coverage of all the stakeholders. And topics include stakeholders overall and questions and experience with smart scale and any element of smart scale that should be changed or remain the same. And this survey will remain open until March 10th. The second survey is focused on applicants for round 5 and will be tailored to and upgrades made to Smart Scale portal for round 5, as well as the applicant resources and outreach and support and communications. And this survey will be released by end of February. That's our target date.
Mr. Secretary,
Yes, ma'am, Ms. Hines.
just a clarifying question.
Yes.
So jurisdictions already got the process review survey, which is looking at the 10 years of the program, right, or 9 years of the program. They're going to get a second, if they applied through the portal this year, they're going to get a second survey, and we want them to fill out both. Is that
That's
correct?
exactly right. Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
To add one more comment. That second survey is actually what they're traditionally used to. So we give them a survey that gives them more input on the user feedback, communications, how is Smart Scale serving you? So they expect that survey, and it is a post-round cyclical survey that they get.
And I wanted to say out loud that they should fill both of them out.
Yes, yes, that would be very good. So the procedural component of this Smart Scale for different categories. I do want to give a little bit of background before I get into this. Every round, the team engages our stakeholders and we enter what is called our lessons learned period. And that is really critical next round. This includes a one-day workshop with all of the scorers that are involved in Smart Scale. We all bring them in this room. It already happened. And we ask them for feedback on inefficiencies, new technologies, new ways to do methodology. We'll be working on the weeds of methodology with the input from those folks that come and give us that feedback. The second thing is that we do all central office and district and DRPT staff that touch Smart Scale, from screening to validations, cost estimates. We get them in a 2-day workshop. And this happens every round, so this is background of what we do. This is coming up in the next few weeks. Next week, actually, we're getting together with all the central office and district staff to discuss their feedback on how the round went. The last thing that we do is we get the feedback from the stakeholder survey that gets sent out. That's coming, that one that is still coming. And then we take any ad hoc emails, letters that we get, that together as our starting point for our procedural review every round. We work plan it and put it into these 4 buckets: improvements to the SMART portal, screening, scoring, and communications components. Those are the 4 areas where we'll focus and make sure that the feedback that we receive gets inputted into improvements that actually happen before round 6. We typically in our office do a data analysis. And that is what we are handing over to be completely independent and external this round, that Ho is going to be leading.
So this slide is a graphical representation of various groups involved in the Smart Scale review. So we talked about the internal and external and who's going to be doing what. We will be working closely with the Technical Advisory Committee for coordination and collaboration. We'll be meeting twice a month. And the Executive Committee, Executive Working Group, will receive study updates and provide guidance. The CTB will be briefed on a quarterly basis and decide on any recommendations that arise from this review. Okay? So let me explain a little bit more about the two by ATCS. And as we discussed previous slides, perform independent statistical analysis of past performance and outcome, and also the result of the process review survey. And the internal team comprised of staff of OEP, VDOT, and DRPT, and they will be focused on procedural improvements. So that's the distinction between the two teams, two groups. We'll be supported by Technical Advisory Committee and the Executive Working Group. The first is the TAC, which is comprised of VDOT Central and District Smart Scale staff and DRPT. It will synthesize the findings of the external and internal reviews and present to the Executive Working Group. And the Executive Working Group, as you can see, consists of representatives from the Secretary's Office, OEP Director, VDOT Commissioner, DRPT Director, and their key staff. And they'll consider the findings and recommendations presented by the TAC and recommend procedural changes to the Secretary and to the CTB. So this is milestones and timeline of our study and how each phase fits together. We have a fairly tight schedule. There's quite a bit of work to do, and you can see at the top of this graph how CTB will be involved during the study. And the next slide, I'll provide you more specific information of exactly how we wish the CTB will interact with the study. Okay, so February, March, provide summary and get feedback on the process review. In April, we'll come before you again and provide you with an overview of survey and historical data analysis. Okay, so we'll provide you a summary of findings from that work. It'll primarily be focused on survey responses, and we don't believe at that time we'll have any recommendations, but we'll give you a summary of the findings from especially the survey. July, August, we propose to have a CTB workshop or a retreat where we can go over detailed overview of our findings and maybe draft recommendations and receive your feedback. And in October, final findings and recommendations will be presented to this board. And December, any policy adoption and other recommendations that the board wishes to take action on. So that gives you an outline of this year and how the CTB will interact with our study.
Sir, Mr. Kasperitz.
It's hard to hear you, Mr. Kasperwitz.
This is of necessity a fast-paced process. I wonder where in that timeline that you've developed do you expect input from individual CTB representatives? Recommendations, input, I guess observations if we don't participate in the survey side of it from this last round.
Mr. Kasperwitz, we are hoping to get some of your feedback as we're meeting with you for the consensus scenario. I think we'll kind of get some overlap of information at the same time. If that would be a good time, that is our current plan, to get that additionally when we meet on the consensus scenario. And we can also be open to one-on-one meetings in the next month or so
Okay,
as well.
so those are things we should initiate if we've got input or feedback that we want to direct.
We will touch base at the same time as the consensus, but if that's not enough time,
Okay.
another initiation, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Just again, clarification for folks who haven't been through this process before. You'll touch base with us for the consensus scenario, which is presented when?
The consensus scenario is actually presented in May.
In May.
But we try to meet in the March timeframe before the spring hearings. So individual one-on-one meetings with district representatives.
So if we want to be part of the consensus scenario, it's incumbent upon us to meet before that.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
okay.
yes, yes.
I think that's
For the
important to know.
consensus scenario is about the current round.
Right.
I understand, but there's
So
pieces of
so they're distinct and different. It just happens to be the timing affords us an opportunity to talk about more than one thing. Because, I mean, you can, it could be overlapping, Mr. Kasparitz, but consensus scenario is not part of the survey and the analysis process. What comes out of that may be, right, and what your thoughts about it may be, but the consensus scenario they're talking about is merely taking what we saw before as the smart scale numbers that came out, and we go through some discussions and we come up with a consensus scenario, right? Which is not what we're talking about when we're talking about how does the process work, what do we think about the factors, all that. We're not changing that for the consensus scenario per se. The scoring is scoring that we're dealing with. So I just want to make it clear to particularly the newer members, those are different things. It just happens we're meeting with you, so we'll talk about this as well. Does that make sense, Mr. Merrill?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Secretary. Just a couple of questions, and I'm not sure if this is for you, Brooke, or for you, Mr. Secretary. Should we initiate the outreach to you to express what our concerns are with the findings? It's number one. Because I don't know how other members felt, but I was struck by how much of the funding for the smart scale round 5 staff recommendations were pedestrian versus highway.
About 12% of money.
In my district, if you exclude one project on I-81, half of the recommendations were for sidewalk and pedestrian, and the other half was for highway.
You talking about dollars, or are you talking, because
Dollars.
typically the dollars are less.
It was almost, actually, it was almost both.
Yeah,
We
so
had
when I-
15 projects recommended, 7 were pedestrian, 8 were highway, but the dollars, if you take out that one $30 million project for high priority, it was 50-50.
And you know, I spoke to that when we introduced this, and what I told you then, I think my numbers are more or less accurate. About 25% of the project submissions were for those kinds of submissions, and about half of that, their rate was about half, so about 12% of the money that was requested statewide was for projects like that. So you may have had a different situation in your district. I
So
didn't
that's
look at
one.
it.
The second question is in relation to CTB member flexibility, because there are several projects that did not make the staff recommendation, but were very close in scoring. And I got some additional information from VDOT and was struck by some of the safety data that compared a project that was recommended versus one that did not make the cutoff. Five crashes, no injuries, versus 29 crashes, 19 injuries. But the sidewalk project came out higher than the highway project. So my question is, what degrees of discretion do we have to flip the recommendations?
The board has ultimate discretion. We could theoretically, as I understand it, and somebody correct me, John, if I'm wrong, we could theoretically fund the very lowest scoring projects, starting with the least scoring, and go till the money ran out, if we wanted to. We'd probably all get killed and fired, and we'd be breaching our duty, in my opinion, but the point is, I believe we have ultimate discretion as a board, as a group. And we've typically, in our deliberations, we've typically given great weight to what members think in their own districts. But we all vote on their own decisions. The board makes those decisions.
So, Mr. Secretary, just to emphasize, the time for bringing those forward is now?
Is now.
Is now. I guess that's...
Anytime.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Mr. Secretary,
Yes, sir.
you're the gatekeeper as a district rep. So, real popular guy.
No, well, my third question is, when we flip the projects that we're recommending for staff and they don't get funded, is there a witness protection program that VTrans?
I can attest to the fact there is none.
There's always a cost, isn't it, Merrill? So thank you all. Any other questions? So this is really a big deal, right? And it is, we are on a tight schedule, but we kind of like tight schedules because it focuses us and gets it done. What this doesn't do doesn't talk about, this is not about how much money we get, right? And how we get it, and sort of how it's designed. This is about after we get that money, based on the legislation it's designed to send it to us, then how do we decide where we're going to spend it in the construction plan, right? So it's the whole thing is really a big question, and you all sort of get into this at times in the discussions as to how that money flows, how it should flow, what the right formula should be, all that, at the funding level, at how much money goes into the Commonwealth Transportation Fund, and how it goes from there, because that's all legislatively driven. What we can control 100% is after we get the money into the smart scale buckets, what is the mechanism, what are the rules that we use, what are our policies to determine how that then gets allocated. And that's, to Mr. Merrill's point, something he's concerned about, some outcomes. So that's where we're operating.
So just to clarify.
Sort of like you get your allowance.
Yeah.
Now you got to figure out how you're going to spend it.
Right.
What
So
we're doing
to
is
Mr.
figuring out how we're
Dodson's
going to
question,
spend it.
though, so just to clarify, so if I'm having recommendations that are slightly different than what the staff recommendation, I should get with my district engineer?
But also, it's that consensus scenario conversation that Brooke initiated, that's where you want to be talking to OIP about, these are the changes that I think I want to recommend, so that OIP has them on their radar.
To Brooke?
John, I think the answer is both. What we don't want to do, I mean, OIP is so they're the ones that collect the information. The district engineer doesn't make any of these decisions, right? They execute the decisions. But certainly, we want them to understand what we're doing as a district member. And so they're not caught off guard and they understand, right?
Secretary, one thing I'll say to Mark,
yeah, Mr.
maybe a lot of towns don't have the revenue for pedestrian construction may be part of your issue too, because towns don't have that much as cities in relation to revenue for those type. That's part of your process.
That goes back to the
long time.
That goes back to the formula funding,
Yep.
not how we spend it in smart scale when we get it. And those are two different. I mean, they're legitimate discussions, but one is a CTB discussion, the other is a legislature and a governor discussion that we can certainly have our input in.
Mr. Secretary, just a couple of clarifiers, I guess. So obviously, I've been thinking about this a lot. Those of us who've been through it know this is a big part of our work. So if, sort of looking at these overviews that they've given us on the statistical analysis and some of the other things, if we have particular questions we hope they might look at in the statistical analysis, where do we send them to Mr. Chang, to Ho Chang, or do we send them? What do we do with what do you want us to do with that request?
John, Brooke.
Mr. Secretary, Ms. Hines, as mentioned during the consensus scenario discussion, we want to use that as an opportunity once we get through that to talk about concerns around the review. If you want to email Brooke with concerns in the meantime, we'll be glad to have those, and we can tee those up and be prepared to talk about them when we do come for those meetings. And Mr. Merrill, to your earlier point about, when do you talk about what changes you may want to make to the consensus scenario. Again, you can hold on to that until we come out and meet, or if you want to feed us some information now so that we can start to look at that before we come to visit. We're glad to have that information.
My suggestion to you is that we're going to have a better process if you give it to us as soon as you have it, so that we can consider it and be thoughtful about it and give some feedback or information, as opposed to bring it to a meeting where we're going, you know. So the sooner the better, as far as I'm concerned. And I'd encourage each of you all to do that.
So, Mr. Secretary, I have one or
Ms.
two
Hines.
other things. You know, I've looked at the composition of the Technical Advisory Committee, and it's got a lot of people who work on Smart Scale. The voice that's not there is the jurisdictional voice, the people who actually make the applications. And I would suggest that that committee's work might be enhanced by the addition of one or two or three people who basically bring the jurisdictional voice to the table, a large county, a city, you know, a town, an MPO, not to overwhelm the work, but just to make sure that the stuff that they experience, which you may not, is actually in the conversation. So just a suggestion. The last observation I would make, Mr. Secretary, is that I suspect I speak for all of my colleagues when I say we are all planning our summer travel right now, thinking about where we're going to go, what we're going to do, when our kids going to be not in camp, et cetera, or our grandkids. The sooner we have dates, the better off everybody's going to be, not going to have to cancel plans. And so I would really super encourage trying to get that date locked down in the location and how many days before our next meeting.
I think we've decided that already today.
Oh, good. Well,
I think Brick doesn't know.
okay.
But when I say that, it's not fair. I don't think we're going off-site for a March, April, meaning
No,
we're
no.
not going to go to,
I'm talking about the July, August. Okay.
I'm with you. When will we have the final dates?
But as we spoke yesterday, I think we were looking, and you saw on the slide, we were looking to do kind of the big workshop, I'll call it, around Smart Scale in the July, August timeframe.
Not March, April,
So
July.
we'll get with the secretary and Carol and try to get those dates. I agree, we need to get those on the books.
It's really important.
Yesterday.
Right.
Yep.
And then
So we'll try to do that next few days.
thank you so much.
Yep.
And then my last observation is that in all of this review of Smart Scale, in the years I've been on this board, it has been my practice, and I suspect others, to, once we have those final recommendations, to meet with my jurisdictions and get any feedback they might have on the recommended changes, just so that I am in the loop with them and they understand if I'm supportive of trying to get a further change or if I have an explanation for why not. It's a very short timeline here between October 17th and the 4th of December to do that with Thanksgiving thrown in. So I don't know if there could be a preview in September that would at least let us have that conversation. And I know that's pressing on the retreat and all of that, but I just offer that, you know, my experience of this, Mr. Secretary, is the more that we are bringing the jurisdictional partners along in these changes, the better off we all are when we actually take the vote. So,
Sons, we will endeavor to do the very best to
Thank
address
you.
that. You know, I think the key is getting the dates in stone, and that gives you 6 weeks between, in November, December, to meet with them. And I understand it's a busy time. I get
I
all,
mean, it's just Thanksgiving comes in there and it
I
just
understand.
roars.
I understand. We'll do the best we can.
Thank you.
Anyone else? And yet, I mean, I think that's a good process, and that's sort of what I was suggesting to Mr. Merrill in terms of being in communication with your district engineer. If you have a different view, just let them know, right?
Well, right,
Whether
but-
it's that or something
Well, I
else.
mean, I have jurisdictional staff who are so it's not about the VDOT district, it's about the jurisdictional staff.
Understand. Gotcha. Thank you. Appreciate it. Anyone else? Everybody good? Mr. Coleman?
You know, if I understood your answer to, Mr. Secretary, to Mr. Kaslowitz's question about when, and the response I heard was now, I don't think it's inappropriate for me to go on the record that I have some strong concerns about some of the projects that are specific to Norfolk. And I'm going to be seeking the counsel of other members of this board that have a lot smarter and a lot more experience than I do with this process to seek their guidance, and some of them have already agreed to do that. But I think, I don't want to speak for Fred, he can speak for himself, but we have strong concerns with some of this, and we want to do it in a professional and correct manner. We want, I want whoever put the applications in to give me reasons why and walk me through why they felt it's appropriate in the spending of the money, because you mentioned a percentage of 12%, and I don't have them off the top of my head, but I would venture to say it's maybe 80% of the smart scale money is going to bicycle and pedestrian in Norfolk. And it may be appropriate. I'm not saying it isn't, but I just want somebody to walk me through this to give me a justification for it.
Yeah, I don't know what it is, Mr. Coleman, in Norfolk, even though I live there, because we don't look at it by city, because our money comes by district. But in I don't look at it necessarily by city. So I tend to look at it either statewide or district by district. Listen, you've heard me speak on some of these issues on the board and here as a secretary, so I don't think, I don't think I've been shy about some of my thoughts. Having said that, we have a process, okay? It's called Smart Scale. We have a scoring process that we have vetted and put into place, this board or boards previous to that. We have a bunch of people that are in the process, that are following the rules and putting in their projects, right? And if we find ourselves in a situation where we're changing the results of the process too often or too deeply, we don't have a process anymore, right? And what we're trying to do in this analysis that we're going through here of the smart scale system is to say, do we need to change it, right? And that's a good process to go through. Do we need to tweak it? Do we need to change it? Do we need to throw it out, start over? I mean, who knows what we're going to say? I don't think it'll be that. But the point is, what we're talking about are two different smart scale round and what's come out of it on the staff recommended scenario that we then get to massage and draw a different answer if we want. All I'm saying is if it is substantially different than what comes out of the process that we're in, that everybody's following, that's a difficult place to put ourselves in. And so I'm a little, I don't want to recreate a smart scale process. Separate and distinct process. Having said that, if any of us wants to change what's on the scenario, we have a right to ask to do that. And sometimes we have done that in the past, not a lot. And we're certainly entitled to do that today, tomorrow, or the next day. But as I've said before, if we do that wholesale and we do it deeply, we didn't have a process anymore. We're going to go back to where we were, and we don't want to go back there.
Well, I understand, and as a businessman, I look for return on investment. I look for what's the congestion abatement and the safety that I think Smart Scale focuses on at least 2 points. I'm just looking for somebody to walk me through how this addresses safety and congestion with the decision that is being made or the recommendations that are being made. And as I said, they may convince me, or they may not be able to totally convince me, but they will convince me to a point where I won't have any objection. But right now, I do have questions, and I just want to go on the record. You may not hear from me again on this point, but I thought it was, especially since Mr. Stan, I think, is going to be fishing in the seas of Florida in March because of the conflict he has. But if Mr. Stant has any comments to make, but we're kind of going through the process.
We'll make sure Mr. Stant's input is inputted.
Lucky you.
Because if we don't, he will. So, I mean, I hope you understand what I'm trying
No,
to
I
suggest to
understand
you.
totally.
So, but to the earlier point, all this discussion, and as we look at these things and have our own view on it, that will inform us as we move to look at what do we change. Not for round 5, just for round 5, but for the system going forward. Yes, Mr. Casper.
Yeah, following your comments, Mr. Secretary. So one of the basic components of smart scale formulation back 5 rounds ago was that we would, as this process developed, look at projects that had come through the smart scale process to determine if the results that we actually achieved were the results that we anticipated and predicted. And you know, we've kind of crossed through a number of important, I guess, time periods now where we've got projects that have been completed that were selected based on expectations of performance, of safety, of congestion mitigation. I'd like to see this, especially at our gathering off-site in July and August, have some ability to look at past projects and see how they actually performed in consideration of the metrics that we applied to those projects back in round 1, round 2, and of course they were evolving. And we may also determine changes that we made in rounds 3 and 4 were appropriate given the results that we find from the earliest phases of smart scale, rounds 1 and 2 in particular. So I'd just like to make that integral component. It was at the outset, but of course at time that we could base those decisions that we're making on. We now have data from past projects, and I think it'd be instructive.
It's a small subset of completed projects, actually, because it takes so long.
Understood.
Yeah.
That's a whole nother discussion, but we do have some. So
I think it also is important, Brooke and John and Ho, that we look at the changes we've made to inform the board what changes we made in previous deliberations and sort of why we made them and what do we think about them now, right? And so for those of us that were not here when that happened, we're not going to have the institutional memory. Your point. So, okay. Anybody else? Fantastic.
Just one last question, I'm sorry.
Mr. Merrill.
Was it a requirement of Smart Scale that there not be any local jurisdiction money into projects? I'm hearing from jurisdictions, they're swinging for the fence.
Any local jurisdiction? No.
Not required.
So 100%, there was
I mean,
never,
one of the issues of
as
Smart
Smart Scale
Scale-
was developed, I was asking, was there any consideration given for pedestrian and sidewalk? Was there consideration given that the local jurisdiction should have some contribution to these, or was that not an issue that was addressed?
And the people that understand this more technically than I do, but one of the concerns about Smart Scale by some regions particularly is that regions that have some different funding formulas are able to buy down projects. And the Smart Scale at its core measures the results against the cost that we're being asked to take on. Not the total cost of the project, but the cost that we're taking on, the state. And so the less that we take on as a percentage of the cost, the better score you're going to get. So absolutely, everybody's incented to put money in to lower their score. Do they have the money? That's a whole different matter, and is there, something in the process we need to look at there? But no, I mean, all these projects have local or regional money in them. I shouldn't say all of them.
No, they don't.
A lot of them do. The big ones do. Right? But no, there's none of that.
Secretary, I was going to
Mr.
say,
Dawson.
Mr. Mark Merrill. Local politicians don't get a lot of credit for building sidewalks, especially a few years down the road. So this is an avenue. I mean, I'm not a local elected official anymore, but, let the state, with the procedure here in relation to Smart Scale, to fund the sidewalk. So, I mean, how many town council members, city council members get a lot of credit for building sidewalks? So that's just observation.
Well, we'll work through this. Well, this is exactly the sort of hacking at it that we need to do, ask questions and push. But thank you. Dr.
Secretary.
Smoot, I was waiting for you, sir. You're going to wrap it
Well,
up and send us
just
to,
one other item.
you're going to talk about New River Valley Rail in a second.
I could do that, but I won't. And we're appreciative of what's been done, by the way.
It's fantastic what's happening there.
Something that has always been a bit vague to me, perhaps to others, I don't know. When you look at smart scale, there are certain parts of the state that have created transportation authorities. There are other parts of the state that have implemented fuel tax increases dedicated for particular projects. So, and I say this without having any sense of good or bad, right or wrong, better as we go through this process, and what the impact that is then on smart scale outcomes. You know, I mean, it begs the question, should every part of the Commonwealth establish a transportation authority? Or should parts of the Commonwealth, or all parts of the Commonwealth, establish particular taxing policies that would then result in better outcomes under smart scale? I don't know. Let's just talk about it as we go through the process, not today.
Happy to do so. I talked about it a lot as a board member.
You did.
I'm now in a different role, but the conversation should be similar. All right, thank you all very much. So the next item on the agenda is the Virginia Passenger Rail Authority recommended budget for 2024. Mr. Pittard is here to join us. Welcome, sir. How are you this morning?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
Great, thank you.
So I just want to start by thanking you all for having us. I'm joined here by the Executive Director of the Passenger Rail Authority, DJ Stadler, several other members of our executive team.
Hey, Steve, will you move that mic sort of more pointed to you? Yeah. Thanks.
Sure. Is that better?
That's much better.
And once again, thanks for allowing us to come and present our budget. As you'll see as later as prescribed that we do that because y'all are a significant funding partner of all the initiatives that we have going on. There are a lot of new members on the board, so I'm going to take a few moments and go through some general information and a little bit of history of rail in Virginia to try to educate those newer members. So bear with me there. And then as I move through these slides, please feel free to ask questions as I'm going. So this is just some general background about our agency. We were created in 2020 by the General Assembly. Our purpose is to promote, sustain, and expand intercity passenger rail and commuter rail service in Virginia. We are given all the necessary duties and powers to be able to operate independently. We were required that we not directly operate passenger rail service, so we contract out the operations of our intercity passenger service. And finally, we are governed by a 15-member board that is appointed by the governor, and those are on staggered terms. This next slide is why I'm here today. Beyond the fact that you give us a lot of funding, it is in our code of Virginia that each year by February 1st we present a budget, a recommended budget from our board to y'all. Y'all should have received this document. Hopefully it's in the package today. We did send it in on February 1st. It includes both our annual operating plan as well as our capital expenditure plans as well as capital and operating grants that we also manage. You are requested to approve the capital expenditure plan for the Passenger Rail Authority. So a little bit of that history of rail that I talked about. Back in 2006, the General Assembly, there was a small rail program called Rail Preservation, but it was a very small program at the time. General Assembly saw that freight rail and then passenger rail on those freight tracks was a vital part to a multimodal solution in transportation. They created the Rail Enhancement Fund, which allowed grants with our freight rail partners, but it was also, they were given out based on a cost-benefit model at the time, which was a long time ago, but was sort of cutting edge. Moving along in 2009, 2010, this was work done at DRPT prior to Passenger Rail Authority. We did start new service to Lynchburg down the 29 corridor, and then also in 2010, a new service in Richmond. 2011, the federal powers that be decided that intercity regional passenger services needed to be funded by the states where those services predominantly operated. So in 2011, we had to come up with a source of funding to fund our passenger rail services, and the Intercity Passenger Rail Operating and Capital Fund was established. And it was using a portion of sales and use tax at that time. Coming on around, I'm not going to go through all these. Some more service and service changes occurred throughout the 2010 to 2019 timeframe. But 2019 began a significant new initiative to expand passenger rail in Virginia, and it was called the Transforming Rail in Virginia Initiative. And it involved working with our freight railroads that own all the tracks and own all the corridor, but involved working with them and purchasing some right-of-way, and also in those agreements getting different service increases, accompanied with certain capital improvements to allow for the passenger service to run on the tracks. So then in May of 21, we worked through in December, and for another whole year, worked through with CSX. And then May of 21, we worked with Norfolk Southern on an extension from Roanoke to Christiansburg. At the same time, the Rail Authority was established to basically operate more as a business, and then at the same time allow us to issue debt, and then to handle the passenger service activities within the Commonwealth. I guess one last point before I move on, 8 trains today, 8 regional intercity trains today, and we have since May of this year been operating at record ridership levels. So those agreements I talked about with CSX and Norfolk Southern, there's some detail here about those agreements. I'll go in a little further detail. I think the main point on this slide is the map, and you see the different corridors that were purchased as part of those agreements. So half of the corridor from Petersburg to Washington to D.C., so split corridor there. From Doswell to Clifton Forge, purchased that corridor, and then Petersburg down to just into North Carolina, Ridgeway, North Carolina, that also was purchased. Those were the CSX transactions. And then with Norfolk Southern, from Roanoke to Christiansburg, you see a green-yellow line. That was a purchase of a corridor there to provide more service in that western rail corridor. So diving a little deeper on the I-95 corridor, was $525 million purchase of right-of-way. As I said earlier, we purchased half of the corridor. And the idea you see down here in the fourth bullet is, through a series of improvements, capital improvements, the goal is to actually separate passenger and rail. It's not a true divided corridor, so I don't want anybody to think there's going to be a big cement wall built between the two. There'll still be interoperability, but ultimately what we're trying to do is divide, and our half of the corridor allow us to do scheduling and dispatch, which is really, when it comes down to it, the control over the corridor. There's a 10-year capital plan involved with this purchase, numerous capital projects in 2 different phases. And with those 2 phases, so at close of the purchase, we got some service. Phase 1, we get new service. And then we complete phase 2 of capital projects, we get additional passenger service. Moving to the Western Rail Corridor, 28-mile of track purchased there, as I said earlier, from Roanoke to Christiansburg. Also $400 million worth of improvements, and that is both in that 28-mile stretch, but also from Roanoke all the way up to Manassas to allow for that second passenger service there. We do expect 80,000 net new riders. As I said, since this train started in July, we've had record ridership since that time. This slide details all the service expansion I just talked about, but lays it out in a different format. So we had the 6 existing trains. We added 2 in 2022, so we're currently at 8 regional intercity trains. And then you see in 26 more service, and then again in 2030 as we complete Phase 1 and Phase 2 of those capital improvements. Finally, this last slide is really intended to just show at a real high level how this 10-year from 2021 to 2030, how this whole program, including our operations, the capital and operating grants, as well as the capital improvements, how it's all funded. So $6.35 billion during that 10-year time frame. And you see to the right, we've detailed out some of the major contributors. So when Passenger Rail Authority was established, we were dedicated a portion of the Commonwealth Transportation Fund. So that's one of the significant providers, about 31% of those costs. Amtrak, we negotiated with Amtrak. There's a signed agreement. They've been sending us funding already. So signed agreement for them because they were interested in these improvements. They have a longer Southeast Corridor high-speed rail vision, and so they contributed 15% towards this effort. Passenger ticket revenues, we have historically operated at about a 70% cost recovery from the passenger ticket revenues. We're still climbing back to that post-pandemic. We've been around 60, 65%, and we fully expect to get back to that 70% level. So anyway, the passenger ticket revenues are a significant portion of this overall plan because this does include the operational cost. And finally, today, or one of the main reasons is, your CTB allocated funding, about 28%, and it's several varied sources. I just listed a couple of the larger ones, the Priority Transportation Fund, I-66 inside the Beltway, looking at doing financing and PAYGO there, and then also some I-95 concession funds. So with that little bit of background, I'm going to move on into our budget for FY24. I'll start with this slide, which basically we had a financial plan which we put out on our website back in May of 2022. And at that time, we had sources and uses of funds balanced. We had $6.35 billion of sources of funding, $6.35 billion of uses. Since that time, obviously, post-pandemic world, also, another point here is the conceptual level of design of the projects that we were handed at inception. It was basically at that level. It was very, and you'll see later, we actually have 7 different levels of engineering that we list for our projects. Basically, all the projects were at level 1. We've advanced those projects now. I think a lot of them are moving to phase 2, phase 3, and soon phase 4 of that design, moving through to construction. So actually getting better estimates, long way of saying getting better cost estimates for our projects. And then the last thing I'm going to say on this slide is this is a continual financial planning process. So lots of sources of funding, as you saw in that pie chart, lots of different projects, operational cost, operating capital grants, so a lot of moving pieces. So we're going to continually be looking at this financial plan throughout the year and expect changes as we move forward. So diving into the prior chart, there was a $129 million increase in sources of funding. So positive news, there were some decreases. did remove the inside the Beltway Pago because of the traffic patterns and the toll collections on that facility. So we thought it prudent to be conservative. We weren't seeing any Pago coming to us, and that had been in the plan, and so we removed that $129 million. The Amtrak ticket revenues have actually been decreased. Amtrak went to a fair pricing model using airplane pricing model, and they did that and kind of jumped the gun on us, and we didn't really get a good look at it before it went out. But 1 month in, we saw the output, have been meeting with them since, and we've adjusted that. However, we were putting this plan together, that was if our adjustments were going to work. I'm happy to say today that I think this item will improve rather than being a negative. Hopefully we can get it back to break even. And then finally, VRE used the Capital Rail Operating Capital Fund, their dedicated source of funding, to help provide funding for this initiative. And they took that $15 million a year, took half of it, $7.5 million a year, and went to the bond market and leveraged it. And unfortunately, so maybe it was a bad assumption in our financial plan to think rates would always be almost zero, but anyway, rates slightly ticked up, and it did cost us a little bit of our financing there. That being said, we have received several large federal grants, $20 million for the Long Bridge project, and then additionally $38 million on the S line. It's a federal pass-through grant from North Carolina, as well as the District of Columbia has put in their budget significant, about $50 million of funding towards the Long Bridge effort. Commonwealth Rail Fund estimates increased. Obviously, the Commonwealth Transportation Fund, y'all are probably aware, had some increases in estimates about 2 months ago. Then there was a budget bill item for service on the Manassas line for VRE. We've worked through how to use those funds. And then finally, there were other increases which involved some interest earnings as rates have ticked up, and then a lot of the other smaller revenue sources had some minor adjustments. So, talking about our $712 million shortfall. So, and on the cost side, how do we address that? So, operationally, we're running trains. That's the core mission of our organization. So those costs we're going to fund. Capital and operating grants, we really don't have any flexibility there. Those are projects grants that we inherited, or they're project grants where the funding has been allocated. So Smart Scale, for instance, has funded a lot of those projects, and we've been asked to be the entity to manage those grants. So not a lot of opportunity to look at cost savings there, so that leaves our capital projects program. As I said earlier, there's 2 phases of those capital projects, a phase 1, and then in FY26, new service will begin, and that's both the Western Rail Corridor and the I-95 corridor new service begins. And then there's the phase 2 of those projects. So in working with our board, the decision was made to recommend let's fund all of the and then we'll work to find the funding to fill that gap in those later years for phase 2. And this next slide will detail the actual funding by project and show you. So the top of this, you see phase 1. So all those phases down to phase 2, we had to, we didn't have the exact amount of money to only fund just the design part of these projects. And so the decision was made to advance design on all the suite, and then the money that was left over, put it all on the Long Bridge project. So that's why you see design and partial construction on Long Bridge. And then there's one S-line design grant match that was to move from the 30% level that the North Carolina funding I spoke of earlier gets us to. There's also the thought to move to 60% design, and that item is a new item in the budget, and it was decided to, at this time, we don't have the funding to advance that.
Mr. Kasperitz.
Just a question to help me understand these timeframes. Where does the completion of the Long Bridge project fall into that timeline between now and 2030?
So it's 2030, the
2030.
completion. And I have a slide, a few slides from now, that shows the timing of the shortfall and when it falls.
What was the original timing, Mr. Pitter?
It was 2030.
And the additional Richmond trains are contingent upon that completion?
The second tranche. I'll
Second
say.
tranche, right.
Yes.
The 3 trains.
And let me say there, we have started service in 22. Phase 1 will start another tranche. Phase 2 will have the third tranche of service. If we do not complete all of the capital projects agreed to in the agreement with CSX, they do have the right to pull the service back that we've already started. So it's really, we need to find a way to move forward. And as I said way back in the beginning of this, the goal is ultimately to try to, say, separate the corridor so that we can do our own dispatch and scheduling of passenger trains, independent of the freight service. So one last thing before I leave this slide. The circle to the left, I think it's important to note, I said earlier, estimate level. So the items that are circled, we've advanced far enough where we've come up with engineered-based new estimates, and that's what this budget is based on. The items that are not circled, we applied an 11% increase to the project cost based on current economic climate.
So, yeah, Mr. Kasperitz.
Yeah, so is S-Line going to be part of a third phase that we don't have visibility into yet because it's contingent upon the completion of Long Bridge?
So S-Line is not part of the agreement with CSX. It is, and you say third phase, I guess you could call it a third phase project. There's improvements here in Richmond that are part of what I'd call phase 3. But the capital projects that have to be completed are what's in phase 1 and phase 2 up here.
To retain our current train status with CSX?
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's a, CSX may remove
It's not
the
a
service.
shall.
So there's more to be negotiated in addition to coming up with a time frame. Is that on the S-Line?
Yeah, I mean, there's negotiations ongoing with North Carolina, negotiations, talks with Federal Railroad Administration, with Amtrak. There's a lot. I dare say we're at our infancy there.
Thank you.
Mr. Secretary,
Ms. Merrill.
on the previous slide, you talked about the Virginia Passenger Rail Authority Fund, the $1.9 billion over the years. Where is that coming from?
That
Is
is-
that fuel tax or?
If I may, that's the
Directed to
Commonwealth
rural-
Rail Fund. The Commonwealth Rail Fund gets a portion of the Transportation Trust Fund. Of the Commonwealth Rail Fund, 93% comes through DRPT and goes to the Virginia Passenger Rail Authority for passenger rail. The other 7% stays with DRPT and is allocated to projects by this board through through our freight program, through our rail preservation program.
Was that from tax revenue, general tax
Yes,
revenues?
that's all the
or-
same revenues that go.
I wouldn't call it general tax revenue, but yeah.
Yes.
It's the big revenue pot that we start with. Mr. Coleman.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. A 50,000 foot question would be, you talk about working with CSX and Norfolk Southern. Are they, and buying, is this a purchase of right of way? Do we control it? Is there a long-term lease involved with this? How does that work?
So it's a purchase of the right-of-way, but then for us to control it, we have to do, so part of the agreement was we had to do certain capital project improvements within the corridor, some on our side of the right-of-way, and then some that are going to be on their side of the right-of-way. And then ultimately, that's when I talk about a Phase 3 and a Phase 4, the ultimate is to have a separated corridor where we do control scheduling and dispatch, because that's owning the corridor gets us halfway there. It's really the scheduling and dispatch of the trains, both freight and passenger, that really, determines the usage of the corridor.
Okay. And my second question would be, you mentioned rail extending down into Carolina. I think that's a good idea, but is North Carolina contributing any money to this project?
So right now, we've in this budget, we are contemplating 30% engineering on that from Petersburg to Ridgeway, and then on the North Carolina side, they go all the way on to Raleigh. And there is a large federal grant, so I think our contribution is $1.9 million, and that's matched by $38 million of federal funds coming through North Carolina. So about $40 million worth of engineering to be done on that corridor in Virginia, and roughly $2 million of it is state funding.
Thank you.
So the next slide just summarizes all the various cost increases. We just talked about the I-95 corridor. Western Rail Corridor has service beginning in 2026, so it fell within the recommended approach of our board. That had some increase. Other capital projects is mostly a federal grant that we spoke of, that $38 million of federal funding. So it's funded through a separate pass-through. And then our board does have an approach where they're trying to build a management reserve. So it's $15 million in the budget for this year for that management reserve, which would get us to $30 million. And that is for items that are not contemplated within the current scope of the capital projects, which that scope includes contingency. So it's items above and beyond contingency, and that reserve is only at their discretion. And then finally, the fourth and fifth line here are, we talked about earlier, grants and operations, which there's not much room for a change there.
Mr. Secretary, I have a question. On the
Madam Sellers.
operations, it said you went from 39 to 72 employees between 1 year. Did you guys phase that in, or is it just, I think it's several new employees. Have we not phased that in, or you guys not phased that in over time? We're just going to hire 30 new people in 1 year?
It is phased, in the budget it is phased in, and I want to make sure.
Hey, folks, let's get focused here. This presentation is about the capital projects for the VPRA budget.
Okay.
Okay? It's not about the operating of the VPRA. That's a
Okay.
separate and distinct thing, right? So what we want to focus on in this presentation, and I know some of you all are new, so you don't know a lot of this stuff, and we probably need to get you up to speed on a more holistic VPRA. But we're getting off the topic of the agenda, which is capital.
Okay.
So if we can get refocused on that, we'll help you get to these other answers.
Thanks. So moving along, this is the slide I spoke of a few minutes ago. We have the $712 million and the timing of that shortfall, and you see that it falls mostly in 28, 29, 30, which is the main construction time frame of Long Bridge.
So let me say, as you get into the next slide, Steve, we're short a bunch of money on capital, right? And it's a combination of we didn't know, which is two pieces. One is we didn't really know what we were going to do because we weren't far enough advanced on the details, and Steve's talked about that. We also didn't know what was going to happen in the world of economics, and obviously that has changed the world a little bit here in the last few years. So those things coming together with the other things that he shows are in and outs have resulted in where we are today, which is we're short. We weren't short before, we're short now. And so the question becomes, okay, how do you deal with that? How's VPRI deal with that? And as Steve will go into I think it's really important to focus on a couple things he just said, which is on slide 16, you can see impact in terms of big dollars are 28, 29, and 30. They're not this year, they're not next year, they're not the year after that. So we're good sort of, we're building a house and we haven't had to buy this stuff inside yet, but we're still on track. No pun intended, we're still on target. But are we going to be able to finish this at the end? And the answer is not today, we can't. And so the point of this is what he's going to talk to you about now on slide 17, which is, okay, that's our scenario. We've got a gap. It's in the out years. These are things we need to do because they're good for this project and because we've got CSX that could pull some stuff back as well. And of course, we'll be talking to them about that if we ever got to that point. But how do we fill that? Because at the end of the day, particularly the Long Bridge, that's got to get done, right? We all sort of know, if you know anything about rail, that the Long Bridge has to be done, and that's a big hole. So this goes into that piece, and that's what I think is particularly important here. One, we have some time. Two, we've got a little bit of a plan, right?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Let me rephrase it. We have a plan.
Before I jump into this to me is the positive news to a degree. That operations number on the prior slide, the majority of it is the cost of running the actual Amtrak service. I don't want to leave with someone thinking that that's our administrative cost. So this slide is, how are we going to fill that funding shortfall? So we have lots of different, let me start over. Our team feels very confident we will be able to find a way to fill that gap. As you see on the slide, there are lots of different balls in the air, so to speak. Tried to color code these with a greenish tint for the ones that we feel better about and a reddish tint for the ones that are a little more up in the air, so to speak. So, talking through these federal grants, we have been accepted in the project development phase of a capital investment grant program for the FTA as of November of 2021. We're continuing to move that process through. There's two different main scoring criteria there. One, we need to score medium as far as project justification. We feel good that we will meet that. Additionally, the other half of that is local funding commitment. And as you've seen, there is a lot of funding coming from a lot of different sources. So we think we can actually score very well I think our application, we're going to go in at a 40% request from the FTA. I say FTA, Federal Transit Administration. This does involve working with our partner VRE because it's based on commuter service and the actual capacity of that service. And I will say IIJA gave a 10-year window for that service to recover, is probably the best way to phrase that. Next item is FRA grants. There's currently out a federal-state partnership.
Let's make this succinct. I don't think we need every detail of everything.
Okay. No, yeah. So several other federal grants here that significant funding we've put in for Long Bridge on those projects. CTB funds, we have I-66. I explained earlier that the pay-go portion, hopefully the toll traffic will change and rebound. Priority transportation year, if we get into out years and might be some excess priority transportation funds available. I mentioned the Amtrak operation revenues and expenses that we've been working with Amtrak on. And finally, there is a passenger ticket financing that we have $210 million planned for that. We actually think, in working with Amtrak the past year, that we will be able to get a significant amount more than that out of that financing. And then last thing, we continue to talk with other entities. Maryland, They're interested in running pass-through service, DC, so lots of different entities. NVTA, we're going to put in an application there. So we're basically leaving no stones unturned, looking to fill this gap. And with that, that concludes my presentation. There are a few slides that provide some more detail. I'm not going to go through those. I do plan to come back in March looking for your approval of our budget.
We have a May 30 statutory date to approve this budget. So whether we come back, we can certainly come back then. But if we have other questions that we want to adjudicate, if we think more about this, we can certainly. We want to do it as soon as we can, and we have to do it no later than May 30th, or it's self-approved. Matt.
Did I hear you correctly that there's a 10-year period that they expecting is going to take for passenger rail, I mean the commuter rail, to recover from COVID? You said 10 years?
I didn't say that it would take 10 years for it to recover.
And you didn't say passenger rail, you said commuter rail.
Commuter rail. Our intercity passenger rail has recovered, and we're actually record ridership. Commuter rail, one of the grant programs, the federal grant programs that we're applying to, has allowed a 10-year window for it to recover. It doesn't, hopefully it recovers before then, but that's what I was referencing.
Like somebody better make another decision in Washington.
Excuse me, Mr. Stanton.
I said somebody could make a better decision in Washington to put people back in the office.
Well, I'm sure there's lots of sentiment for that.
The last thing I'm going to say is a lot of new members, a lot of information thrown out there. If anybody would like, we would be glad to schedule a separate meeting with any of you. Just work through Carol and we'll set that up.
Fantastic. Anyone else? Thanks, Steve. Appreciate it. The next item on the agenda is the 23 update of the urban street maintenance payments. Our farmer. Good morning. Or it's good afternoon, almost good afternoon. Almost still morning. Good morning.
Morning.
Welcome.
Thank you. This morning, I'm going to give you a brief update on the use of the reserves we established in the budget process, and Russ Dudley is going to follow me and talk about the implications for the cities and counties and the street payments that we make to them for the remainder of this current fiscal year. So you might remember that during budget development in the April and May timeframe of last year, we're very concerned about the direction of fuel prices and the implications on VDOT's contracting for paving, as well as the agency's operations. We established some reserves for the current fiscal year for that potential impact for both VDOT as well as our program for VDOT's maintained assets, as well as localities, total just under $199 million. We've reviewed those paving commitments and the contractual adjustments that we had to make in the 2022 paving season and the implications on what we set aside for the budget, as well as the operating costs for the department. So in terms of the contractual release, we need about $90 million from the reserve to cover the commitments and the payments we've already made for paving, the 2022 paving season. We also reviewed the amount of funds that the department has used for operations during that similar period of time. Our fuel costs are about 25% higher than they were the previous year. So with that in mind, as well as taking a look at consumption and how we replenish those reserves in terms of fuel, our recommendation is to release $6.5 million from the reserve. When you look at both of those VDOT components together, they represent just over 60% of the reserves we established for the department. And so we recommend a corresponding release of the reserves we established for the localities. This table summarizes the reserves we brought forward in 2023 in the budget in June, as well as the revision in July, totaling $198.9 million. and the recommended release for both VDOT and localities.
Laura, I think the key here for me is that when we found ourselves where we found ourselves, we made a judgment to hold some funds back. And we were trying to be conservative, but not too conservative, right? And so hold back almost $200 million. And what we're saying now is we've needed to use 121 of that $200 million. And so I think what this says to us is that we did a good job of estimating sort of where we were. We were conservative, so there's some left. We'll see how this goes forward, but I think they did good work here. That's what I got out of this presentation.
Mr. Secretary?
It'd be nice to be able to forecast it to 100% of accuracy, but that's not possible. And I'd rather forecast a little high in this case to be more conservative with our money and the locality's money than low. So I think it's good work. Thank you.
Mr. Secretary?
Sir, Mr. Mayor.
Ms. Farmer, thank you for this. Could you just explain the third bullet, the financial assistance? Are we providing 23% of the increased cost that they're incurring for the maintenance?
It's so it'd be money that we were going to give to them normally, and we said we're going to take the same percentage back from you that we took from ourselves.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Farmer. Mr. Dudley, you complete? Perfect. Thank you very much.
I'm going to follow up, pick up, and let you know how we can well as an additional application for available. Farmer noted the department is recommending to remove. I'll provide a little more detail. But we have two separate budgets for localities maintaining their own. All our cities, county population. Other towns that specifically have. Others for our counties that maintain, that's Arlington and Waco. The share of these released allocations is 20. Sorry, yours is not picking up.
Russ, we can hear you,
Sorry.
but I want to make sure the feed can hear you too.
Okay, gotcha.
And it doesn't seem to be, so just use that mic.
All right,
please.
sure. The share of those released allocations is about $20.9 million to our urban system and $3.7 million to the counties. As noted, we have two budgets for locality systems. The board approved these budgets back in June of '22. Our urban system budget was just about $432 million, and the county budget was just under $75 million. In the 2022 General Assembly, the special session, it approved $15 million to supplement our urban system budget, but the appropriation came a little too late for this board to approve the distribution of those funds. So we're proposing to include the additional allocations available to us from both the release of our fuel reserves funds, those that Ms. Farmer described, and the 2022 special session allocations within the final two quarterly street maintenance payments for the urban system and our localities. Now, before I get to the implications of that and the next steps, I wanted to give an overview of our street maintenance payments program for some of you that may not be familiar with it or may not have participated in it. So it's just a short refresher here. For the urban system, side. So for the urban system, Virginia Code provides specific eligibility criteria and the payment process for the streets that can receive state maintenance payments. Annually, the board approves those payments, and VDOT inspects the arterial routes of those streets in the urban localities annually. Payments are based on moving lane miles, so we do not include mileage or lane miles that are like parking that is not available to peak traffic or turning lane miles in our calculations. And we have two separate categories of payments, one for arterial routes and the other for collectors or local streets. Now, Arlington and Henrico, as I mentioned, are the only two counties that maintain their local systems. These are non-primary streets. And we have a maintenance payments program that is similar to our urban system, but there are some minor differences. Like the urban
Russ,
system.
I think you can lose the handheld, well, maybe.
Feeling good about that. Like the urban
There you
system,
go.
eligibility criteria and payment process is outlined in Virginia code, but unlike the urban system, payments to Arlington and Henrico are not based on functional classification. They are based on total eligible lane miles maintained in the county. So they are not based on a moving lane mile calculation. During our annual, during our maintenance, along with our quarterly maintenance payments, we include 3 additional types of payments to our localities. First, we distribute overweight permit fees that are collected by the DMV. We also include $1 million for the city of Chesapeake to support the upkeep of bridges. And we include $1 million split between the 4 localities hosting tax-exempt real estate to compensate them for that lost revenue. None of these are impacted by today's discussion. So this slide provides the results of the additional allocations to our localities for the next 2 quarters. Our urban arterial rates will increase $1,000 per lane mile. Our urban, local, and collector rates will increase $2,349 per lane mile. Arlington will see an increase of $1,018. Henrico will see an increase of $741 per lane mile. So our next step is relatively easy. It's approval of the quarterly payments, or the updated quarterly payments for quarters 3 and 4 this afternoon. Any questions?
Mr. Secretary?
Yes, Ms. Hunt.
My question's actually for Ms. Farmer. So if my math is right, we have about 77 million still in reserve, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Does that just stay in a fuel reserve, or do we do something else with that money?
Sure. So as promised, we will take that balance and deploy it in fiscal year ¡24. So the recommendations for ¡24, when we come for the final budget, we'll see an increase in funds available for distribution of $77 million, because we established separate reserves and allocations for fiscal year ¡24.
So distribution into the paving system, or general distribution?
General distribution.
Oh, so we might see a small uptick in smart scale funds available, or revenue sharing, or other things like that?
Yes, ma'am. All the other things being the same, it would go through the construction distribution. We have a few actions by the General Assembly that may impact other VDOT programs, so there'll be a couple of moving parts.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Sure.
All right, well done. Thank you very much. So, decision point. VTrans, before or after lunch? I think we probably,
After lunch.
after.
Before.
Oh, let's do it now.
The left wants it before, the right wants it after. It's about a 20-minute presentation, John. Is that right? Let's go ahead and do it. Let's do it. Jatender, let's do it. I think we're totally engaged now. I don't want to get disengaged and then.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you, sir. Welcome. Mr. Lawson's got a few
Yeah, I just want to make a
intro
couple
comments.
brief comments, Mr. Secretary, members of the board. As talked a little bit this morning, VTrans definitely plays a big role in what we do and how we decide how to fund. We're kind of at a cycle now where it's time to do some updates. And what Jatender is planning to do is to talk a little bit about the process. Obviously, we have a lot of new members on the board that haven't gone through this before, so we want to talk a little bit about that. Kind of just tee you up with what we need to do over the next 12 months or so. And again, we also will be doing probably in March, probably at the March meeting, a lengthier workshop around this to try to focus more on some of what we need to do, what we're going to do. The ones that have been here before, you may recall that we did this the last time over the series of several meetings, and it seems like we spent a lot of time catching up with what we talked about before. So we think it may be better to do it more in a consistent one time or in less settings in order to get through it more effectively. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jitendra.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, members of the board and those watching this presentation. My name is Jitendra Ramchandani, Office of Intermodal Planning and Investment, and my purpose today is to provide an overview of VTrans, which is Virginia's statewide multimodal, which means it includes rail, buses, highways, all these things. An overview of VTrans. Now, again, it will be a repetition of some of the things that some of the board members may have seen in the past years, but for the benefit of everyone in the room, I will do that very quickly. And then, as Deputy Secretary mentioned, provide a timeline of activities that are anticipated in the coming months and in the coming years as well. So, first of all businesses, whether they are public or private, do a planning exercise. They may just call it different things. VTrans is sort of the brand name for the Virginia's transportation plan that looks at all modes of transportation holistically. All federal government wants all states to have this plan, so that is one of the main reasons it is done. But Virginia is very unique in the sense that in addition to federal requirements, legislature has entrusted the Commonwealth Transportation Board with conducting a comprehensive review of statewide transportation needs as part of this transportation plan, VTrans. So if you have opinions and guidance on where our transportation needs are and what the extent is and what the priorities are, this is the planning document that does that. The second one is an important one procedurally, is that the code requires Commonwealth Transportation Board to submit the plan to the General Assembly and to the Governor's Office every 4 years. The last submission was at the direction of the board in December 2021 was done. And so we anticipate that there will have to be another one done in 2025. And as John, Deputy Secretary mentioned, it is a lengthy process that is done over the years. So I would like to focus on a couple of items. So those are the sort of the board requirements, statutory requirements. Sort of business-wise, as I alluded to earlier, this plan identifies transportation needs. It also does a review of external factors that are going to be impacting transportation in the coming decades. And then finally, identify related to that. All that is done as part of 4 policies that the board has established. So this graphic is showing 4 pillars, and I will briefly explain this slide, and then we'll touch upon each pillar in the subsequent slides. So the first one from the left is the vision, goals, and objectives. Again, all business entities, public and private, have vision, goals, and objectives. And these vision, goals, and objectives guide how the transportation needs are identified, how they are prioritized, what are the risks that we finally, the recommendations. So I will now brief on each pillar in subsequent slides. So the pillar 1, vision, goals, and objectives, right? The first pillar from the left. Board adopted these vision, goals, and objectives in 2019-2020 timeframe, and they are to be reviewed every 4 years. These provide the guiding document for how the transportation needs are identified. So our thought at this point is to come to you, the board, in the coming months, and so to modify needed and adopt these vision, goals, and objectives by the May timeframe. And I will go through the timeline in more detail at the very end. The second pillar that you saw from the left was the transportation needs. So this slide is showing two maps on the right, right? The very first one, the pinkish looking one, is showing roadway segments that have at least one transportation need based on the established board policy. Now, as you can see, there's a lot of roadways that light up, right? And so after looking at that, when board adopted that policy in 2020, the board directed us to come up with a way to prioritize these needs. And therefore, the map on the bottom right of it. But that map, if you're able to see the colors, prioritizes these transportation needs in red, orange, yellow, and green. So green is lesser priority, red is a higher priority locations. These policies are reviewed periodically, and at this point, our thought is to come to the board with some recommendations for potential modifications later this year. I will note that these transportation needs cover a wide variety of transportation needs that we imagine. So one of the things that is included is congestion mitigation needs, travel time reliability, transit access, transportation safety, roadway safety. So the board policies are essentially establishing when does a condition becomes a problem? When does a condition become a need? And that is where we would like to request board's guidance and review in the coming months.
Mr. Jitender?
Yes, sir.
These slides do not reflect cost. They're just a need. So if you look at these, it's important to understand that, because it really would be also nice to look at cost at some point. So like a project that's creating a little green blip that's a priority, does it cost $1 million? Does it cost $100 million? Right? We don't see that here. We just see it's a project that has a need.
That's a very important distinction, and that's where some of the things, other policies that the board have established come in play. So for example, according to the Code of Virginia, every single project, every single funding request that is submitted in smart scale has to meet at least one need that is identified in the board's transportation plan. And that's when the board, as part of the smart scale policy, looks at, well, where are we getting most benefits our bunk? We want to solve this problem, but how do we solve it? Determined based on the smart scale process, right? That's where localities can come up with innovative solutions and say, we can solve this problem for less cost, and they get funding, right? The second significance of this transportation needs is revenue sharing. So you had a couple of questions related to revenue sharing. Revenue sharing program prioritizes projects that are trying to meet needs, the ones that are identified in the board's plan. And finally, there is a board policy that says that we have so many transportation needs, as Secretary pointed out, is that we need to prioritize them. So according to the board policy, planning dollars are targeted at priorities 1 and 2 through a program called the Project Pipeline. And that's where UIP, working with VDOT and DRPT, tries to say, we have a problem X, how can we come up with a cost-effective solution to solve that problem and ensure that they get funding through smart scale, revenue sharing, and other funding programs. So that was the second pillar from the left, right? And the third pillar, the third major policy that exists is, well, that is for the next 10 years, right? But as we know, and as Secretary has pointed out, that the world might look very different in the coming decades. According to the federal requirements and in compliance with the state code, VTrans has to look at 20. That's when we don't want to identify transportation need. We want to say, well, we have a cone of uncertainty where things might line up. And this cone of uncertainty is defined by 10 global trends, ranging from automated vehicles, e-commerce, how people are consuming goods and services, how frequently and how much are they teleworking, those sort of things. But there's a cone of uncertainty. So instead of having a particular problem, board policy looks at these 10 trends and does periodic monitoring of these things so that we remain on track. And finally, once we have identified vision, once we have identified transportation needs, and we are more aware of risks and opportunities, long-term risks and opportunities. The fourth pillar, the one on the left, the rightmost pillar, takes a look at actions that can be done in the coming, in the near term to address some of these items. So with that, that was a very quick overview, and for some of the board members that are new to the board, it might be a bit overwhelming. So I hope we will have an opportunity to discuss these in greater detail with you. But just to leave you with the timeline of things that are in the coming months. So the diamond that you see is where we request board action. We anticipate board action. So as Deputy Secretary Lawson mentioned, we want to come to you with to discuss the vision, goals, and objectives, the very first step in the process, and then potentially request an action in the May timeframe. That will provide us enough guidance to identify or modify the policies for the needs identification and prioritization that we hope to have action in the October timeframe. Now, let me mention why that October timeframe is important. These transportation needs that the board will identify this year will be used for the next round of Smart Scale, round 6, that starts taking applications in the March next year. So localities would want to know, well, where do I want to submit my project? Where do I want to do my study? Where do I want to data collection to ensure that I'm ready for Smart Scale? So that's why this October deadline that you see is important, because localities are actively looking forward to having these needs out there so that they can propose solutions for the next round of Smart Scale. And finally, while it is next year and the year after that, the two pillars, others are long-term risks and recommendations. Those are in the coming years as well. So with that, Mr. Chair, I will turn it over to you, turn it back to you, and see if there are any questions.
Thanks, Mr. Ramchandani. Questions. And John, do you want to follow up on the timing? And we talked about getting together for a group and just reiterate that in the next steps.
Yes, sir. I think as Jitendra mentioned, we're looking at the next month for the board workshop to have a kind of an extended discussion around the vision, goals, and objectives, and try to work through that kind of in a kind of an extended setting versus hitting it over a couple of different months. And then, so
we're likely to have a longer meeting.
Yes.
What I'm trying to tell you.
2 days next
So Freddie,
month.
Mr. Stant, excuse me. You're going to miss the longer meeting. I know that breaks your. But
Yes,
so
and
it may
then-
be at 2 days. The reason I'm bringing that up, we may do like a long VTrans, good solid day. 5-6 hours or so maybe. I don't want to do you all day because we'll run out of energy there. But and then the next day we'll probably have meetings. So it's probably going to be a 2-day meeting. That's my point. And we're going to get that out to you quickly. But
Mr.
that's what we're looking
Secretary,
at.
I really appreciate being able to have a deeper conversation. I think that's really great. One of the things that would be helpful to me when we look at the vision, goals, and objectives is to sort of understand where we are relative to these risks. So what has changed since we looked at that the last time, and how might that influence?
Inform us, sure.
Yeah, inform us. And then the other thing, and Mr. Ramchandani knows this is a bugaboo of mine, is how current is the data that underlies the needs? So one of the things, just for people to remember, in some of our districts, we have other entities that are doing significant funding. And when we looked at this the last time, some of that was not integrated into the maps. So the maps are on the web right now. We can go look at them. But if you're trying to sync it up with what you might know about what's going on 81, or how HR TAC is deploying dollars, or in my case, Northern Virginia Transportation Authority, you may not be seeing the whole picture. And we need to get that fixed. But this is a great way to kind of look at your district. I will just commend it to my colleagues.
Great, thank you. Anyone else? Thank you, Jitendra. Thank you, John. Mr. Burrell, you want to go, you want to just, you got,
Want to knock it out?
yeah, why not?
All right, so in your folders, I have my usual director's report. I'll hit on a couple of highlights for you. On the rail side, we hosted a delegation from the British Embassy and UK Transport last month, focused on freight rail. Also, in your package is a summary of the applications we've received for our freight rail programs. We are oversubscribed, so I'm just going to go ahead and put it out there that we'll be using our prioritization methodology for that. On the transit side, we have been notified that we've received a national award for the Virginia Breeze for our recovery, ridership recovery marketing initiatives, which we have, higher than pre-pandemic ridership. So we'll be accepting that award later this month. Also on the transit side, we are also oversubscribed on all of our application-based programs. So we'll be coming to you, we'll give you a preview next month, but coming to you in April with those recommendations. This month, I've also added a couple of additional pieces of information in here. We're a small agency with a large program. We have had some challenges on the administrative side, which not the least of which right now is a 17% vacancy rate. So we are continuing to struggle with staffing. So we are prioritizing. We're a lean, mean organization, but that is a struggle that impacts our ability to deliver our programs. But on the good news side, we've had some really good new hires and some promotions from within. So really proud of the team and how they're rallying together to get things done. General Assembly related, I mentioned last month we had a couple of bills related to the Commonwealth Mass Transit Fund. Again, really proud of the team. Those have come through both houses unanimously and are well on their way to being done. So we'll be bringing you policy recommendations based on that legislative change this summer, as well as another piece of legislation that appears to be making its way through having to do with the TRIP program. So we'll be bringing you a new CTB policy for that later this year as well. Rest of the package is the usual ridership updates. We're continuing to see our ridership grow over trying to get back to pre-pandemic levels. On the transit side, we have been hampered with some challenges. I was talking to Ms. Sellers earlier. We have 2 transit systems in Northern Virginia that currently have work stoppages underway. That hinders our ability to provide good, reliable service and get folks back on transit. Virginia Breeze ridership continues to grow, continues to exceed our expectations, and continues to grow year over year. And Mr. Pittard said earlier, Amtrak also, we've set a record every single month since May of last year. So until they tell me I can't say that anymore, we're going to continue to say we broke the previous record for December. So we're going to keep up that trend. So there's a lot of data in here. All of that data we push out to the public through our open data portal. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions as well.
Great report in the package, Mr. Murrell, thank you. And let me say this. Back to her slide 4. They are struggling with personnel. And without getting into all of it, I think you're going to be better when you end up than when you started. And so we're trying to make sure we give Mr. Burrell the support to get that done. So I think she's going to have a better agency when she's finished restaffing than where she is when she took over. So we're excited about that. But they are working hard and doing what needs to be done to keep us as performing as well as we are. So thank you very much for that.
Mr. Secretary?
Yes, sir.
Just one question. Jennifer, on the Virginia agency slide, is that all the local bus services throughout the whole Commonwealth?
So that is on slide, just for everybody
Slide
else's
6.
benefit, slide 6 and slide 7. Virginia agencies is everybody except for WMATA and VRE, which we've pulled out separately.
All right, thank you. Mr. Bridge, Mr. Commissioner.
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, I'm going to defer my comments to the March meeting and extend that March meeting even further out. I do anticipate, as Jennifer said, with the General Assembly wrapping up, being able to give an overview of the bills that would be affecting the department. So I would anticipate bringing that back to you at the March meeting as well.
Great. I'm going to defer my comments to when we return in a few minutes. And And so I'm going to adjourn this meeting of the action meeting of the board, excuse me, the workshop meeting of the board, and we will adjourn for a brief lunch, 40 minutes or so. We'll be back.
30 minutes.
Thank you.
Congratulate Jennifer.
Hey, folks, call us back into order.
Take care of us.
I'm going to use this time to make a couple remarks, a couple things I want to tell you all about, which is left over from the workshop meeting, but I don't think it matters where it is. So, obviously very busy this time of year with the General Assembly, which is always fun and exciting. So we'll just see how that turns out and what they do. There's lots of things in there that could affect us one way or the other in terms of money or other things. And so we've weighed in on some and others we've not. And, they will do what they do, and then the governor will do what he does, and then we'll know. But in any case, so we're excited, lots of good stuff going on. One thing that we need some help with, and I've asked Greg Yates to lead a group to look into our revenue sharing and our transportation alternatives programs and look at some policy changes. In 2018, we updated our revenue sharing policy, and we told VDOT to come back in about 5 years, and let's look at sort of where we are and how that's worked. So that's the intent, is to come back now and to do that and to consider any potential policy changes for these two funding programs. And the intention is to look at, and you've heard some of this before as you've sat around the tables here, but to ensure the timely delivery of our projects along with the timely use of funds allocated from these programs. Sometimes we have money that just sits and we sort of play a shell game with it, and that's my term. And we want not to do that. When we allocate money, we want to use it because it doesn't do us any good until we do. And so we want to make sure time to market is as quick as it can be and that we're executing well. We also want to identify any additional opportunities to create efficiency in the delivery of these programs and to ensure consistency with our other funding programs and to find or explore for opportunities to increase the effective and equitable distribution of the funds. So we'll do that over the next few months. And anybody that wants to participate is certainly allowed to do so. I've asked Mr. Yates to chair the group. I'm going to ask Ms. Hines to jump in if she'd like. She's got a lot of info and she's been involved in this. Mr. Laird, jump in as well, and Mr. Stant. But anybody's welcome. It's not exclusive here. I'm asking you all to do it as sort of representative group. So anybody that wants to raise their hand after the meeting and be involved, you're certainly more than welcome to be involved. There'll be public meetings. Whenever more than two of us get together and talk about business, it's public. And, but most of it we'll probably be able to do remotely. We won't be having to come back to Richmond every 2 seconds to work through it. So we'll use that to get there. So hopefully in a couple, 3 months, we'll come back with some recommendations, either to make no changes or here are the changes you might recommend. And we'll go from there. Not a lot other to say about in my comments. And so if there are no questions, I'm going to move into the action meeting. And the first item on the action meeting is the public comment period. And Mr. George Mapp is here. Mr. Robert Whitfield is on deck. Good afternoon, Mr. Mapp.
Thank you.
Did you come from the Eastern Shore today?
No, I was in Williamsburg.
You were in
last
Williamsburg.
Night, so
Okay,
not so far to drive this time.
Welcome.
But thank you, and happy Mardi Gras to everyone.
Thank you.
As they say in Louisiana, let the good times roll. We got some good news on the Eastern Shore Trail project. The last meeting, one of our smart scale projects proposals scored well, so we're optimistic that we'll have a section in Accomack County funded near Onancock. This month we've been working on a RAISE grant with the VDOT and the consultants, $25 million grant. So we're rounding up letters of support, and thank you, Secretary Miller, for yours. Steve Johnson suggested we also ask for a letter from Commissioner Britch, which we've done as well. we'll have a public hearing coming up next month, and that'll be for the VDOT's 6-year improvement program for the bike trail portion. We're still working on the piece from Cape Charles. We have a $2.5 million community project funding grant for that. And of course, the cost went up this year, so there's a $500,000 funding gap there, so we're working on that. With that, thank you for your support.
Thank you. Keep our fingers crossed for you, sir, and continue to help. Thank you for coming. Whitfield, good afternoon. Welcome.
I walk with some impairment these days, so it sure would be appreciated if you could point us to where a spot we could park nearer than having to go down the hill and back up.
I wish I could help you with that, sir.
And also where to eat within half a mile of here would help too.
Every day.
I'm Rob Whitfield with the Fairfax County Taxpayers Alliance, and I've been to, I don't know, somewhere between 1 and 2 dozen CTB meetings since about 2015, but I've been going to transportation meetings over 30 years, and so I have some sense of some of what goes on. But I must admit, as to things such as smart scale, they're a black box to me. I don't know the details and how the policies are derived. One thing I did notice in what was presented earlier is I didn't see any attempt to reach out to the public in setting your new priorities. So my suggestion would be, depending on how far you're progressing on this in the next couple of months, is that when you have your 6-year plan review meetings in whenever that is, May, that you provide advanced information to the public about your smart scale update process. Because, as you probably know, other than Noel Dominguez from Fairfax County, I think I'm the only person who's been down here more than half a dozen times. And so I don't know how many people listen to you online. But one of the problems that you have ongoing is a lack of public involvement in your decision-making process. And I don't know what to suggest. I have complained that in Fairfax County, that the transportation projects that get submitted, not just to you all, but to NVTA and maybe to the feds under the IIJ, the public is kind of left out until they've already made their decisions. That's got to change. I don't care if it's legislation or regulations or what. But the net result is most of the public knows little about what is going on. So I can hope, but I don't know what to expect regarding the, I mean, maybe it would help if you had in Northern Virginia, you had some session to help educate the people of Northern Virginia, maybe at NVTA, I don't know. But one of the problems we all have is that now you're updating VTrans, and as I sent to Secretary Mill recently, the MWCOG Transportation Planning Board is starting on their Visualize 2045 plan, and included in that is a proposal to do zero-based budgeting, which means if you don't have already approved federal money, as I understand it, you're going back to the beginning of the drawing board. So that's going to have a huge implication for some jurisdictions and some projects. I don't know the details of this yet. One thing as to going to the Virginia Passenger Rail Authority, I didn't hear Steve Petard mention, there was some mention of FTA money and maybe the Federal Railroad Administration. I didn't hear that there was IIJA funding applied for. So if you know what that situation is, I'd appreciate knowing, because right now the plan still includes, although it was deferred for this year, the funding by the I-66 inside the Beltway. And I've said repeatedly in the last 2 years that that's a wrong-headed approach. And I've asked Steve Petard several times what alternatives for funding Did you look at in Northern Virginia, for instance? I'm not advocating this, but if you had a 1/4% sales tax in all of Northern Virginia, that would be more equitable than the presently proposed I-66 inside the Beltway funding. So I don't know when you're going to come and see us in Northern Virginia. I'm told it's going to be the Governor's Conference, again in Arlington County. I got to tell you, most of the Northern Virginia population lives outside the Beltway, about 2 million of the 2.5 million. And so we really would hope that you come and see us rather than going to Arlington County all the time. Got much more to say, but I'll leave it for another day. Thank you for your attention. And I do try to, it's very difficult to keep, it's like juggling a lot of balls in the air. So I don't know what it's like for you, but that's what it's like for me.
Similar. Thank you, sir. Appreciate you coming. Appreciate your engagement. All right. Anybody else from the public? I only had 2 signed up. Thank you all for coming. The next is the approval of the minutes. They were sent to you in your package for review. Mr. Merrill moves.
Second.
Ms. Hines seconds. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed say no. Are there any abstentions? One last thing, Steve, before you get going. You look so good up there. You're like good image for this transportation group. We have 2 people here that are somewhat new to the CTB, I think, on our staff. I think we've introduced Rachel before, but I'm going to do it again if we haven't. Rachel Jones, Deputy Rachel Jones. Rachel joined us. She's actually a Richmond native and lives here in Richmond, but she joined us from the Hill, from Washington, where she last was with the National Association of Manufacturers, but she's had a fairly long career is not the right term. She's had a substantive career on the Hill, and so she comes to us with great expertise and knowledge, and we're excited to have her as a new deputy. I also have Jason Powell. Is Jason still here? Jason. Jason is a great find. We stole him from Senate Finance. He was the numbers guy at Senate Finance, which is, if you've been on our side of the street in the last month or 2, it's been obvious that Jason left Senate Finance and came to us. So we got helped and they got not helped. But in any case, Jason has joined us as a senior advisor, which is a senior position. And he'll fill a utility role for us. He knows a lot about state government. He knows a lot about transportation finance and transportation. So we've actually used him in various places as they've needed help in the administration for legislative expertise and numbers expertise and so forth. So it's really, we've got a really strong team now with our agency heads and my staff, which is strong and collaborative and working well together. So we're excited to have all those folks here, and I wanted to thank them for joining us. And welcome. Now, Mr. Bridge. They got to watch you the whole time on streaming TV, though.
I was so excited, just wanted to get it going. You've been thinking about some public comment.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, the first item that I have before you is the authorization for the Commissioner of Highways to enter into a standard project agreement between VDOT and the Hampton Roads Transportation Accountability Commission for the I-264 Independence Interchange Access Report and the execution or authorization for the execution of additional standard project agreements should we take that project and advance it into the development and construction stage. As you recall, Chris Hall, the district engineer for the Hampton Roads District, was here last month to present to you on this effort. And just as a reminder, the Hampton Roads Transportation Accountability Commission is funding this particular study that is valued at $1.25 million, and it is for the interchange access report development for this particular interchange. And again, this resolution does authorize the commissioner to execute future standard project agreements should the project advance into the development and the construction stage. And with that being said, staff's recommending your approval on this item.
Are there any questions? Stant, do you have a motion?
Very necessary project, and I move that the resolution be approved.
Pat makes the motion. We have a second. Mr. Coleman, are there any questions, any following discussion? All right, all in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed say no. Are there any abstentions? Thank you very much, sir. Next item is item 2. It's presented by John Lynch, and it's action authorization for the Commissioner of Highways to enter a memorandum of agreement with the United States of America. Sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the board. As you mentioned, the item I'm here today is for the authorization for the Commissioner of Highways for the MOA with the United States of America through the Department of Interior's National Park Service, Department of Federal Highway Administration, Eastern Federal Lands, and the County of Arlington for the Mount Vernon Trail North Enhancement Projects, which was presented to the board last month. To accomplish this, the project has developed a MOA that establishes the roles, responsibilities, funding, and procedures for design and constructions. There is one minor change in that draft document from last month. It was to potentially add the City of Alexandria if the Department of Interior requests that. So the action today, VDOT recommends that CTB approve and authorize the Commissioner of Highways to execute the MOA among the county, National Park Service, Federal Highway Administration, and if requested, the City of Alexandria with such changes as the Commissioner deems necessary and or appropriate.
Mr. Secretary, I move approval.
Second. Tons, thank you. Mr. Yates, seconds. Are there any questions or comments? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no. Are there any abstentions?
I'd like to abstain.
Let the record reflect that she's abstaining. Excuse me. Sellers abstains. Thank you. Mr. Gregg. Good afternoon. Asset
Afternoon, Mr.
Management
Secretary.
Division. Item 3, sir.
Yes, sir. This is a follow-up to my presentation last month. The Virginia Department of Transportation is requesting the Commonwealth Transportation Board authorize the Commissioner of Highways to sign one or more standard project agreements with the West Virginia Department of Transportation Division of Highways to allow for improvements to the East River Mountain Tunnel. December 8, 1964, the Commonwealth of Virginia and the state of West Virginia entered into an agreement for the handling of maintenance of the interstate tunnel East River Mountain. The 1964 agreement provides that costs other than routine maintenance, the West Virginia Department of Highways shall bear the cost for the portion of the tunnel in West Virginia, and VDOT shall bear the cost for the portion of the tunnel in Virginia. As recently as December 6, 2022, the CTB updated and provided an annual approval for the Special Structures Program 50-year long-term plan, which included a risk-based prioritization of needed work planned for the East River Mountain Tunnel over the next 50 years. VDOT recommends that the Commonwealth Transportation Board authorize the Commissioner of Highways to enter into one or more standard project agreements with West Virginia for those improvements to the East River Mountain Tunnel identified in the Special Structures Program 50-year long-term plan.
Any questions?
Mr. Chairman, I move approval.
I have a question, too.
Yes, sir. Mr. Yates.
Secretary, just a question. I'm just curious, what's the proportionate sharing of expenses on that?
45% for West Virginia and 55% for VDOT.
That's based on the length of the tunnel, or?
Yes, sir, based on the length of the tunnel in each state.
Okay.
Pro rata.
Gotcha. Okay.
Anyone else? Mr. Folks has made a motion, so let's get a second.
Second.
And Ms. Sellers seconds. Is there further discussion? All right, great. Hearing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no. Are there any abstentions? Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Next item on the agenda is item 4, Mr. Todd, Rail Industrial Access for Ashton Creek. Welcome, Mr. Todd. Good afternoon.
Hope all is well.
Sir, thank you. Same to you.
Thank you for having me today. Last month, I presented a rail industrial access application from Ashton Creek Industrial Park in Chesterfield County. The request is for $450,000 with a total investment of about $3.5 million. They did exceed the minimum point threshold in their application scoring, and so we recommend approval of the resolution today.
Thank you very much. This was brought up in our last workshop meeting. Mr. Brown?
So moved.
We have a motion for Mr. Brown. Is there a second? Mr. Merrill seconds. Is there any further discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no. Are there any abstentions? Thank you, Mr. Todd.
Thank you very much.
Next item is item 5. Mr. Chris Swanson, action on rescinding location approval for Interstate 7781 overlap.
Yes, good afternoon, Mr. Secretary, members of the board. You have a resolution before and the existing location decision for the Interstate 77 and Interstate 81 overlap in the Bristol District. The board issued this location decision on May 16, 2012, approving alternative B as the location for the overlap project. The rationale to send the location decision is based on the information reviewed during the January workshop last month, which included the fact that there is currently no funding allocated or identified to implement the overlap project. There are financial implications on adjacent property owners, and any efforts to advance the overlap project at the approved location would require a reevaluation pursuant to NEPA and demonstration of fiscal constraint, which would include public involvement. For those reasons, the staff recommends that you rescind this location decision.
Have a motion?
Motion.
Mr. Kasperitz moves. Is there a second?
Second.
Mr. Coleman seconds. Is there further discussion?
Mr. Secretary,
Mr. Smoot.
just very briefly, I will vote against this resolution. And the reason is that while I fully understand that it is not going to be constructed anytime in the foreseeable future, unless probably taking a long look, that it is likely that the 7781 overlap will eventually be constructed. And property owners along that corridor, in my view, should remain on notice that that is likely to happen. There is really no alternative location for this. And it can come at great cost to the Commonwealth eventually, if and when this is developed. If there's further development within this land, this right-of-way, and accordingly, I think that we should continue to have this approval of record. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, may I respond to that?
You may make some
Yeah,
comments.
this is within the Bristol District, just so everybody knows it's not shown. As Mr. Swanson pointed out, and this started in 2012. It's outdated, it's outmoded, it's antiquated, and that section of 8177 is 3 lanes on each direction now, and I believe that until the entire section of 81 from the Tennessee line to the West Virginia or Maryland line is 3 lane on each side, this ain't going to happen. And so our staff at the Bristol District strongly supports the recommendation of the staff here to abandon this.
Anyone else? So this is one of those things that's, you know, it's sort of, there's good reasons on both sides to be thoughtful about what we do. As somebody that's been on both sides of this before personally, I guess at least on the landowner side personally, and on this side as my job, I'm sensitive to both pieces here. Sometimes I'm not sure what my best answer is, but I think it's always been for me, Mr. Folks' point, how long is it going to take? What's the likelihood? And, you know, if it's 30 years from now, maybe we should recognize that somehow or not. But it's one for debate. I don't vote in this body unless there's a tie. So y'all are going to make that decision, I presume, here today. But it's a, you know, I understand both points, Dr. Smoot and landowner. I had this location on me for a long time, and it finally came it bore fruit about 30 years later, but it only really impacted me, and I wouldn't do anything different anyway, so in any case, I'm belaboring the point. We have a motion and a second. Mr. Merrill?
Just one question. Am I correct in assuming that the consequences of this are the landowners will now have greater flexibility with regard to their future development of their property and not be constrained by the threat that at some point there'll be an interstate highway through their property?
I would say market opportunity, not legal opportunity.
Market opportunity, yeah.
That's the concept.
That's reasonable. Right now, it could be viewed as an encumbrance on those because of the action previously.
Yes, Mr. Coleman.
My question is related to this intersection and how it might be enhanced with the development of the inland port at Mount Rogers. Any thought been put to that?
With the, I'm sorry, the
Inland port.
Potential inland port.
Yeah.
I am not aware how this has been evaluated in that context.
I think it's too early to know, Mr. Coleman, is the answer. Meaning, early to know.
I didn't know how many people, I don't know how many people on the board know that there's a proposal.
Sometimes my staff gives me that look, like, just leave it there, will you?
Okay.
It's too early to know. We just don't have the data yet.
Right.
All right, we've got a motion, we've got a second. Is discussion wrapped up? Anybody else? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say no.
No.
Are there any abstentions? Ayes have it. Motion's approved. Thank you very much, Mr. Swanson.
Thank you.
Next, Mr. Kevin Gregg's going to come back up instead of Mr. Prezioso. And we've got three actions, one right after the other, but we're going to take them separately. Mr. Gregg on number 6, please.
Thank you, sir. First one is the commemorative naming of the bridge on Route 672, Old Fincastle Road, over Martins Creek in Lee County, as the Alfred E. Montgomery Memorial Bridge. Mr. Montgomery was born in July 22, 1921, on Martins Creek near the Rose Hill in Lee County. While serving his country, he was a flight engineer on a B-24D Liberator named Malicious, assigned to the 9th Air Force 376 Bomber Battalion Group, 513th Bomber Squadron. Ex-Sergeant Alfred E. Montgomery is memorialized on the wall of the missing and received the Silver Star, Distinguished Flying Cross, and the Air Medal, and a Purple Heart. The Department of Transportation recommends this request be approved.
Your motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move approval.
Second.
Mr. Folks?
Second.
Mr. Folks, did you make a motion?
Yes, I did.
Mr. Coleman is going to go second. Appreciate it, Ms. Hines. All in favor, please rise to signal that with me, please. Thank you very much. Item number 7, Mr. Gregg.
Second one is the commemorative naming of the bridge on Route 620, Poor Valley Road, over the North Fork of the Powell River, Lee County, as the Scott D. Delph Memorial Bridge. Mr. Delph was born October 30th, 1937, near Stone Creek in Lee County, and resided in Lee County until his family relocated to Indiana in the early 50s. Scott Delph enlisted in the United States Navy in 1956 and served for 12 years. Scott C. Delph was killed in action while in the helm of his boat when a rocket struck the fuel tank, resulting in a massive explosion. DM-1 Delph is honored on the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. He was awarded the Purple Heart, Combat Action Ribbon, Conduct Medal, the National Defense Service Medal, the Vietnam Service Medal with Star, and the Republic of Vietnam Campaign Medal. The Virginia Department of Transportation recommends this request be approved.
Mr. Chairman, I move approval.
Thank you, Mr. Folks. Ms. Hines, would you like to second?
Second.
Second by Ms. Hines. Please signify your affirmative vote by standing, please. Very much. Mr. Gregg, number 8.
Thank you, sir. This is a commemorative naming of the bridge on U.S. Route 211 west of the South Fork of the Shenandoah River, Page County, as Dominic Nick J. Wenham Memorial Bridge. Mr. Wenham began his career in law enforcement as a state trooper with the Virginia State Police from 2006 to 2016, and then served as an officer with the Stanley Police Department from 2016 to 2021. Dominic Nick J. Wenham was a dedicated servant who selfishly sacrificed his own life in the line of duty on February 26, 2021, while serving and protecting his community. The Department of Transportation recommends this request be approved.
Approve.
Have a second? Second. Laird seconds. Mr. Merrill makes the motion. Mr. Laird second. Please join us in standing to signify your affirmative vote. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Heltzel, welcome.
Thank you,
Location
Mr.
and design,
Secretary.
Mr. Heltzel.
Pardon me?
Item number 9.
Item number 9 is action on a limited access control change for the I-64 Hampton Roads Express Lane Segment 4C, roughly between LaSalle and Settlers Road. The widening of the road from 3 lanes to 4 is creating the conditions for this modification request. We're pushing those lines out. We do have public support for it, and the FHWA has endorsed it as well.
Let me say this about that for the edification of people that don't know it any more than I did. I always sort of looked at access control, limited access control changes as, you know, long stretches of road where we're going to put a driveway into it, right? And we're going to have, you know, it's going from a limited access and we're putting brakes in it. And so I said, well, on the interstate, and we have lines on every road. It says, here's our line of this road. It's a limited access control line. And when we widen them, we just push these out, right? And that's all we're doing. We're just pushing some lines out on a map, sort of. Is that right?
One point of clarification, Mr. Secretary. We have these limited access controls where the board has established them.
Okay, fair enough. So all we're really doing here is moving some lines on a drawing that says these are our new limited access control lines as we widen this part of the interstate. That's what this is about. Okay. Do we have a motion?
So moved.
Stant moves. Do we have a second?
Second.
Coleman seconds. Any further discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no. Are there any abstentions? Thank you, Mr. Helpful. Number 10.
Number 10, Mr. Secretary, members of the board, is for the intermodal connector. It's, again, limited access control changes. They are being requested by Navy as a part of their effort to improve their security conditions along the access control that's on the intermodal connector. It has the Navy's endorsement as well as the Federal Highway Administration.
Mr. Stant?
So moved.
Or second?
Second.
Mr. Coleman seconds. Is there further discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no. Are there any abstentions? Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Appreciate you coming. Item number 11, Mr. Dudley. Back.
Afternoon,
Mr. Dudley, you ought to be like, you know, you were the VCU or JMU today, and you're purple.
It's all JMU every day.
I have to throw that out so I could get Mr. Brule
There's some
into
yellow
this as
there,
well.
but it's not the right yellow.
It's not the right yellow, is it?
Isn't that right?
Well, I got what I wanted. Perfect.
Yes, sir.
Welcome.
Good afternoon,
So,
Mr. Secretary.
item number 11.
Members of the board, I've got 3 items for your consideration today. Number 11 is our annual revenue sharing deallocation. Each year, we bring a list of completed, canceled, or other projects with surplus so that they may be deallocated and become available for reallocation. Typically, that's in our next allocation cycle or the application cycle. Back in December, all the board members received notice of these deallocations. District members received the list of those projects in their districts, and at-large members received the entire list of the entire state. That's Appendix A on your resolution. Today, I have a request of deallocation of $8,365,770 from 47 projects for your approval. Accordingly, we request your approval of the deallocations.
So moved.
Hines makes the motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Sellers? Ms. Sellers seconds. Is there further discussion?
Yes, Mr. Secretary, I was going to
Mr. Dodson?
clarification. Does the money go back to the districts or into district funds?
No, sir, these are not distributed.
Statewide.
So it will go back to the statewide, and then it will be redistributed through our application process. So
Thank you.
We'll have some more money.
Anything else? We have a motion, we have a second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say no. Any abstentions? Thank you very much. Item 12.
Okay, the next two items are related to my presentation this morning with Ms. Farmer. Item 12 is a request to increase the urban street maintenance payments for quarters 3 and 4 as a result of the release of our fuel reserves and the supplemental allocations made available during the 2022 General Assembly special session. Our new payment rates for arterial routes in the urban system will be $28,012.07. And locals and collectors will be $16,446.80. We request your approval for the new quarterly payments as noted on the resolution for our 85 urban system localities.
So moved.
Ms. Hines makes the motion. Is there a second?
Okay.
Mr. Folks seconds. Further discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say no. Any abstentions? Thank you very much. Item 13.
Item 13 is request to increase the street maintenance payments for quarters 3 and 4 for the counties of Arlington and Henrico as a result of the release of fuel reserves. Arlington's quarterly payment will increase from approximately $5.4 million to $5.9 million for quarters 3 and 4 and result in a payment rate of $21,517 per lane mile. Henrico quarterly payments will increase from $13.2 million to approximately $14.6 million, resulting in an adjusted payment rate of approximately $15,657 per lane mile. We request your approval for the new payments.
So moved.
Hines makes the motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Brown seconds. Is there further discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say no. Are there any abstentions? Thank you, Mr. Dudley. Item 14, Ms. Pryor. Good afternoon, Ms. Pryor.
Afternoon.
Welcome.
I have two easy items for you today. The first item is my normal monthly transfers, and I recommend your approval.
Motion?
So moved.
Mr. Merrill moves, Ms. Hines seconds. Is there further discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say no. Any abstentions? Thank you very much.
Okay. The second item is the amendment of 39 projects to the 6-year program. These are all local systemic safety improvement projects. Normally, we would add these projects as part of the normal 6-year program update in the June timeframe. Because the funding is available and we've completed the review process, we wanted to take the opportunity to take action on this amendment now so that we could get the funding out to the localities to begin this work. It's been several years since localities have received safety funding, and so we're eager to get it in their hands and get the projects moving. So we recommend your approval.
So moved. Mr. Casperits moves. Is there a second?
Second.
Ms. Sellers seconds. Further discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no. Are there any abstentions? Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Pryor. Mr. Coker, welcome.
Thank you, sir.
Got great news for us.
I do.
Thank you, sir.
Good morning, Mr. Secretary, members of the board. I have 16 projects today to discuss in excess of $5 million. So the first project is Order 107 in the Bristol District. This is a 2023 plant mix project. Let me get straight here. Sorry about that. Primary to secondary routes in Dickinson and Wise counties. We received 2 bids, the low bid being $7,418,152.72 from Bizak Construction out of Lexington, Kentucky. And this bid was within range, so we recommend award.
We've got about a dozen of these that are in range. You want to lump them together if they're in range?
Yes, sir.
All good with that?
Yes.
That's a great idea, sir.
Okay, so we're going to do all these. We're going to go from 107 to 410 in the Richmond District. That's in sequence in your package. There's all in the green within range. I'll entertain a motion to approve all of those projects in this vote.
So,
Councilor moves, Mr. Folks
Second.
seconds. Is there further discussion? Anybody want to hear anything more about these? All right, we have a motion and we have a second. And I guess did we just vote? No, we didn't vote. Got a motion, we got a second. No further discussion. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no. Are there any abstentions? I fumbled over it so badly we could have just done one at a time and been in the same place.
Did a great job, sir.
Thank you. All right, we're going to skip to page 13 that has order number J20, Hampton Roads District, Mr. Coker.
Yep. Catch up on the slides. Okay, order J20 in the Hampton Roads District. This is a concrete pavement repairs on the Interstate 564 in the city of Norfolk. We received 2 bids. The low bid was $5,592,467.50. This does exceed the range. The low bidder was Richard Height Concrete Construction out of Norwich, Virginia, and we recommend award.
We had a lot of discussion about this, Mr. Stant, in my warm-up. Mr. Stant makes the motion. Mr. Folks, Mr. Coleman seconds. Is there further discussion? All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed say no. Are there any abstentions? I'm going to take the next 2 as a block. That's order number 510 and order number 924.
Motion to approve.
Second.
Is there further discussion? Motion was from Mr. Merrill, second was from Ms. Hines. Is there further discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no. Are there any abstentions? And we've got order number J05, Mr. Coker.
Yes,
Stanton
sir.
District.
J05 in the Stanton District. This is an on-call signal and ITS project throughout the district. We received 2 bids. The low bid was for $6,422,841.98 by Richardson Wayland Electrical out of Roanoke, Virginia. This does exceed the range. However, we recommend award.
I had one question, Mr. Secretary.
Mr. Merrill's got a question. Let's get a motion in a second.
Okay.
Do you have a motion?
I'll motion.
Motion to approve. Is there a second?
second.
There's a second. Now let's get some discussion. Mr. Merrill.
Could you comment why you think it came in over the range? Because this is not concrete and pavement, thing like this, more technology. Just curious why it came in high.
Yeah, it's an on-call project, and it was outside the range, but it was less than 1% outside the range. We received 2 bidders. The next bidder was 30% higher, so we feel that this is a fair market value.
Can you describe a little bit, Mr. Coker, the on-call nature and what makes that sort of different?
Sure. So an on-call contract is, we have a loosely defined scope. So we have a set of items and quantities that the contractors place bids upon. And there's no set plans. It's just a general idea of what type of work will be needed. And then as this work becomes apparent to the district, they call on this contractor to go out and perform the work.
Time and materials type arrangement?
It's sort of time and material. Or it's not time and material, it's unit prices, I guess, right?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Skaspritz.
Is Richardson Wayland the incumbent?
I do not have that information, sir. Sorry.
So they basically, you give them a sort of a laundry list of things. Say, how much would you charge us to do these things? And then they give you an answer, right? And then as you do those things, you send them a bill for the various components of those things. And they send it to us, and then we pay them. So it's not a project that is, we're going to go spend $6.4 million on this right here at this place, and we know exactly what it is, and it's going to be that. That's not what it is.
Mr. Secretary, just more of a question. Is this like a not-to-exceed number then, if it's a time and materials, or how does it work?
It's not for any specific thing.
Right.
It's for it's for IT and signal work as it arises, right? So it could, in theory, be zero.
That's my question. Okay.
Could, in theory, be, as a practical matter, it won't be, but it could, in theory, be zero. That make sense?
Yes, sir.
So it's sort of like Plumber says it'll take this amount of money to do these 8 things. We don't know if we're doing the 8 things. We may do 1 thing, or maybe do 2 of the third things, or whatever it is. And they give us a number, and that's how we contract with them. And then they bill us according to whatever the negotiated rate was on those various individual 8 things. Does that make sense? So we have a motion, we have a second. Yes,
I'm
Mr.
sorry, just
Mayor.
one other question. Is this consolidated with other districts in the Commonwealth?
Each district has their own.
Is there any
There's
benefit?
various types of on-call contracts.
Is there any benefit of combining them?
Can be. Depends. Mr. Bridge?
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, there are at times that it does make sense to consolidate our ITS work, geographically based. Signal work is one that should probably be kept to the district level simply because of the time to be able to call out if a signal gets hit, gets knocked down, the time to replace it, and the call outs are much more immediate rather than traveling 325 miles from if it's along the 81 corridor. So we've tried to keep it from a response time basis for signal and ITS type work. There's others that are much more geographically based that are consolidated across district boundaries.
I will tell you, to get to your point, we certainly want to do that when we can. Efficiencies. We have a motion, we have a second. Anything further in discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed say no. Are there any abstentions? Our last project is project number DB115.
Yes, sir. This is a design-build project in the Bristol district. This is to replace the I-77 northbound lane bridge over Route 606 in Blaine County. We had 5 bids. The low bidder was $11,410,683 by Brayman Construction Corporation out of Saxburg, Pennsylvania, and we recommend award. It was within range.
Chairman, I move approval.
Folks makes the motion. Is there a second?
Still a low bid.
9 seconds. Is there further discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no. Are there any abstentions? New business. Thank you, Ms. Coker. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Any new business come before the board? Hearing none, we will have a very busy summer. Smart scale, VTrans, revenue sharing, all sorts of stuff. So once legislators try and go back to their districts to work with their all do. Got a lot of work to do, and we're looking forward to getting it done and get better. With that, I will adjourn the meeting and wish you all well. And say one thing at the end. In Ukraine.
Mark.
All right, hold the fort there.
Two.
See you, bud.